Real estate investment practice problem using Excel. Home buy versus rent calculation, part 1. Get ready because we're raising the stakes with real estate. Here we are in our Excel worksheet. If you have access to the Excel worksheet, would like to follow along, note that we have 3 tabs on down below: example, practice, and blank. Let's take a look at them now, starting with the example tab, in essence being an answer key. On the left-hand side, we have our information, in essence, our assumptions we will be making in order to do our analysis of purchasing a home versus renting a home side by side. On the right, we'll go through the calculations, which right now will look quite intimidating, most likely because we've got a lot of tables we will look at, but we'll do it in one-by-one, step-by-step process in at least 2 presentations, so it will break it down into digestible chunks. We first have the amortization table we'll take a look at, which we've constructed in the past. We're going to put together a pivot table so we can get our information on a year-by-year breakout. Then we'll take a look at a summary, in essence, of the pivot table that we can use to make references to. Then we want to take a look at the property value. So when we think about the home, that's usually the more complex calculations that will be taking place. So we'll focus on there. Renting is usually more straightforward. It's just the cost, in essence, of the rent. So we want to estimate what the property value will be, because that's going to be one of the things that's going to impact the purchase decision versus the renting decision. How much do we think it's going to be going up in value? We want to think about the cash flow, which could be involved with regards to the purchase decision, which again can be a little bit more difficult because we might have different things involved, including property tax, insurance, maintenance, the loan costs. We then have the tax component with regards to the purchase of the home. For example, some things might be deductible, such as the property taxes and the interest. Then we can think about the net cost after taxes, comparing then the cash flow to the renting cash flow. And the renting would be fairly straightforward typically because it's just going to cost the rent, right? We can get that pretty quickly. The difference between the cash flows we can then take a look at. And then we can take a look at the cash flow if there was a sale that took place, meaning what would happen if I sold the property. This is a confusing component because we can imagine that we sell the property if we had a purchase each year, meaning what would happen if I tried to actually realize the gain on the equity in the home on a year-by-year basis. One of the things that kind of complicates this type of calculation or comparison. Then we'd have to think if there's any tax consequences for us selling the home, which may not be if it's our personal residence because we have a significant exclusion. And then we've got the cash flow after taxes, and then we can kind of compare the two on a year-by-year basis. And you have a fairly complex table looking like this in order to do this, but we'll break it down when we basically get to that component, so we can kind of see the comparison renting versus purchasing and the comparison of our IRR on the cash flow of the decision for that as we go out to the 30-year time frame. Obviously, once you set this up, then you can go all the way over to the left and you can change your assumptions that would happen in the left and try to see what would happen with different types of assumptions. Okay, the second tab, the practice tab, this is going to have some blue areas which are pre-formatted, so you can work this practice problem a little bit faster using that tab. The third tab, the blank tab, we're going to be building this thing from scratch. One little scratch, we're building it. So here's our information on the left-hand side. We've got the property information that we're assuming. Purchase price going to be $750. The initial rent we're going to say is $24,000 a year, so $24,000 a year for the rent. The rental growth rate, so we're going to say that the rent's going to go up from year to year. We're going to assume by 2%. Obviously, these assumptions you can change if you're predicting kind of inflation or what's going to happen in those terms. The property growth, we're going to say the property is going to grow at the same rate, meaning if I purchase the home, I think it's going to be increasing by 2%. Now, 2% is fairly modest. You could say that's going to go up basically with inflation. Over time, you would expect something like the property to possibly go up and down over time, but possibly over the long run, maybe grow at something constant like a 2% or 3% or something like that. But again, you can change these interest rates if you so choose. You would expect generally the rent to go up due to inflation, and generally rent generally goes up. It doesn't often go down. But the property value probably expected to go up in the same way due to inflation, but there could be other factors that kind of vary the growth rate of the property. And then the insurance, we're going to say is $700 a month. It's going to increase by 2%. We're also going to keep that standard 2% kind of like it's an inflation rate. So things are basically increasing. The costs are generally going up at the 2%. That may or may not be the case for expenses versus the property value, meaning the property value might not be going up at the inflation rate. You might think it might go up faster than the inflation rate and so on. So you can vary these once you get things settled down. But then we're going to say that the marginal tax rate is going to be 25%. So that's the tax rate that we're paying taxes on our income tax return. It's not the average rate because we got a progressive tax system. We have to use the top rate because that's going to be the differential rate. So remember, there's a progressive tax system. You pay multiple different rates. If you're at the higher income level, you don't want to pick the average rate because when you're doing something different, you're paying at the margin. You want to take the difference, which is in essence the top rate. So we have the property tax is going to be at the 1.5% that we're going to assume the property tax will be, and it's going to go up as our property value goes up, which may not happen on a year-by-year basis, but you would expect it's possible depending on where you're at. The property taxes could increase as, in essence, the value of the property increases, possibly, depending on how things are set up where you are at from a state and local level. Selling expenses, we're going to say are 7% to sell the property. So when we think about the home purchase, obviously to realize the gain in the equity in the property, if we had to actually realize it, we'd sell it, and we'd have to take on the selling expenses. We're going to say that the loan information, loan amount $600,000, which we're saying is 80%, meaning we put 20% down on the $750,000. Now, obviously, if it was a large loan or something like that, you might have multiple loans. The loan structure could be a little bit more complex, possibly, but we're going to say $600,000 on the loan. We're going to say the interest rate is 7%. The loan is going to be for 30 years. And then we'll calculate the payment over here. Let's actually do that. Let's calculate the payment. So the payment would then be, let's say, negative PMT. We've done this in the past. I'm going to do this a bit more quickly to just calculate the payment. It's going to be picking up the rate, which we're going to say is the 7% interest rate divided by 12 to get the monthly rate, comma, number of periods. Number of periods is going to be the 30 years times 12 to get the number of periods in months, and then comma, the present value is going to be then that $600,000 loan amount, not the home purchase price, and enter. So there we have the 3,991 annual payments. If I just take that and multiply it times 12, would be this times 12. And the equity in the home that we have put down, which is in essence equal to the deposit we put down, the down payment, is the $750 times 20%, or $750 minus the loan amount. That's what our starting point equity is. That's our starting outflow that we would have on the purchase side versus the renting side. Let's go ahead and build our amortization table. So I'm going to say years, months, payment, interest, and I'm going to do this fairly quickly because we've seen this in the past. I'll construct this fairly quickly. Loan reduction and loan balance. Something like that. I'm going to select these rows. We're gonna then format them. We're going to say, let's wrap the text up top. We'll wrap the text. Let's center it. Let's make it black and white for our headers, as typically is our customary headers as we've been going here. Black and white. Let's make these possibly a little bit larger so it fits. And then double click here, maybe bring it down. That's good. Okay, then the months. We're going to need 360 of them. 0, 1, 2. Adding or selecting those three cells, putting our cursor on the fill handle, dragging all the way down to 360. 360 on the months. That's going to be 30 times 12, bringing it all the way down. And then we'll center that. The years then, I'm going to use my little trick on the years we talked about before. It's going to be basically taking the year out and rounding it down. I want to fill everything on every year columns so I don't have any blank cells, so I can convert this into a pivot table. So I'm going to say this equals round down, and then I'm going to go 12 out and then divide it by 12 months, which will be 1, and it should round it down to give us 1 even as I copy it down. You've entered too few arguments. Hold on a sec. Round down, and then I need to say comma comma 0, comma 0. Just give it the digit. There we go. And there should be no decimals if I copy it down. Like there's no decimals. So it's 1. And if I copy it down to 13, it should convert to 2. There it is. I'm going to double click, take it all the way down. And there's one little glitch at the bottom. Let's center it while we're here. One little glitch at the bottom is that the last year, you got to shore up the last year because you got those zeros there. So I'm going to say this equals the one above it, and then just shore that up. And there's our years beautifully implemented. I got year 0 up top, which I'll center it. I had to hard code that, but everything else populated nicely. I'm going to put zeros on the payment, the interest, and the loan reduction for period 0 because there's nothing there, and I want to have those cells formatted for my pivot table just in case it messes anything up, to have blank cells. The loan balance, we're going to say, is going to be the 600,000, and then the payment is simply going to be these payments to the left that we calculated. I'm going to equal that payment. That's in our data now, so I'm going to select F4 on the keyboard, $ before the E and the 1, so I can copy that all the way down, putting my cursor back on it, double clicking, copying that down. The interest then we're going to calculate as equal to the 600,000 prior balance times the rate, which is the 7%. That 7% is outside my table, so I need to make it absolute. F4 on the keyboard, $ before the B and 15. Then I need to take that whole thing because that's a yearly rate and divide it by 12 to get the months. There we have it. Let's copy that down, double click in the fill handle. Hold on a second. Well, that's because I don't have my loan balance here. And then I'll subtract this out. This is going to be equal to the 3992 minus the 35. So there's our difference. The loan balance is going to decrease by the 600,000 minus the 492. Let's copy these down, and these zeros should populate once we do so. So I'm going to copy this one down. I'm going to copy this one down. There we go, and let's go all the way down to the bottom and see if it fully amortizes to 0 to double check that things have been done the way they should be done. And they looks like they have, because that goes to 0. That's our double check. 2 checks applied. If there's a checkbox next to the to do thing here, we got 2 checks. We got 2 checks next to it because we double checked it. So now we're gonna make a pivot table out of this. I want to make a pivot table to summarize this data on a yearly basis because that's going to be easier, of course, to work with than the amortization table. Now, we could construct this basically what we're going to get from this pivot table kind of by constructing it with formulas, but I think it's easier to do the amortization table and nice to have the amortization table as a reference and a double check and then make the pivot table. We might do it another way in a following presentation to kind of construct this instead of a vertical kind of fashion in a horizontal fashion. In other words, when I start to do some of these comparisons, because these tables are being built with the years on the vertical axis, we'll tend to keep that trend because that'll be easy to apply out. But you might want to apply this information so the years are up top, and then you can have longer descriptions and whatnot. So we might do it 2 ways just so we can get some practice working with our tables. And it might be easier to see in some other ways in a following presentation. Let's add our pivot table though. Well, let's add a couple tables. Let's make this data set into a table, like a normal table first. So I can go to my insert tab, and we're gonna say we want to make this into a table. Let's just make it a normal table. Just make sure your cursor's inside, but not like 2 cells or anything highlighted, just 1 cell. And there we go. It should select the whole table. Going to say okay. There's our table. I'm going to say we're going to have a total row at the bottom, so it totals everything up for us, and then maybe total like this up, sum this up maybe, and then sum this up, and then sum this up, and this one we don't need a sum because that doesn't make any sense. And so there we have that. You might want to remove the bands, for example, so you could go to your table designs and say you just want like the normal table like that, and then maybe make your own format by making it like borders in blue, which is our normal thing. See, I just want to put blue borders on it, borders, and then make it blue because that's what we normally do. The colors, the bands they come up with are strange sometimes. So then we can maybe format this, squish this back up a bit. So that's our normal table. That gives us our slicer and whatnot if we wanted to add the slicer or to filter by year. I'd also like the pivot table because that'll give us a whole table by year. So that's a nice easy thing to do. So we go insert. Let's make a pivot table now. I'm inside this table again. I'm going to say let's make the pivot table. I'm going to go to an existing worksheet, and I'm just going to put that right here in column N1. In N1, place in the pivot. Place in the piv. Let's make this a little smaller. And so we'll bring out the years down here. Going to pull that to the left. I'm doing this quickly because we've seen this in the past. So we'll just reconstruct the pivot table. If you want to look at prior presentations to do this a bit more quickly or slowly, you can look at those prior presentations. We're going to say this is going to be the payments, the interest, the loan balance, the months. Now this table, in essence, you can kind of construct with formulas on a year-by-year basis, but like I say, the pivot table is a little bit easier to use. It has, of course, its pros and cons, which we'll talk about as we go. So I'm going to format these. We're going to go, let's value these, and then say I want to make it look nicer. So I want to go to formatting the cells, make it currency, bracketed, no dollar sign, no decimals, okay. Next one, the sum of the interest, value the field settings, number formatting, currency, brackets, no dollar sign, no decimals, okay. And then the next one, the sum of the loan or whatever, we want a number format that one, currency, brackets, no dollar sign, no decimals, okay. And then lastly, we've got the loan balance format in that one. We want to have the minimum balance, format the cells, currency, brackets, no dollar sign, no decimals. I made more decimals, okay. Remember that minimum balance, that's different than what we've done so far. We're not summing, we want the minimum loan balance to give us the lowest loan balance, which will be the balance at the end of the period, which in this case is the end of the year. So there we have it. Let's format this a little bit. We're going to say, let's go ahead and format this, put our brackets around this one maybe. Do our brackets like we normally do. We could make it blue. I won't make it blue though. I'll make it bold. And then I'll make the top black and white on the top font group, black and white. Wrap it, alignment, wrap it, center it. Looks great. Let's select this whole thing then and make it a little smaller here. A little smaller, squish it up a bit. Now this pivot table, let's make this center this here, has the pros and cons of it will not automatically refresh when you refresh the data. You'll have to right click on it and refresh the data. That's one kind of component of a problem. And also you don't really want to be referencing like the pivot table amounts like that usually, because when you change the pivot table, it might kind of mess up these references. Now it might not as well if you just use the pivot table for this one purpose, meaning you don't like adjust the pivots. But if you do anything else with the pivot table, then this reference won't make any sense because your table will be showing different data. So you may not want to reference the pivot table. So you might then, whenever you adjust the data, copy the pivot table over to another set of data. Might be the safer way to go. So every time I refresh the data to look at another scenario, I would right click on the pivot table, refresh it, and then copy the data into the table to the right instead of referencing the table. You could, and again, you could reference the table, but generally, if you're planning on using the pivot table for anything else, like pivoting it in other ways, then the references to it might be a little skewed. So typically, I'll then say, okay, I'm going to copy this information on the pivot table. I'm just going to copy the whole thing, Control C, and I'll put this over here and just right click and paste it 1, 2, 3, just the values. So now we have our table with just hard-coded numbers in it. And then I'd have to refresh these hard-coded numbers, meaning there's no formulas in them every time I refresh the pivot table if I want to use different, basically, scenarios. That's one of the kind of downsides to a pivot table if you don't want to reference the pivot table itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and format this. I'm going to go to the black and white. We're going to wrap the text. Let's center it. And let's make this centered. centered. And then this, let's make this blue. Let's do our blue and borders on this one so we can make it distinct as the one that we're working with. And then we should probably make this column a little wider maybe, and this column a little bit wider. So now we've broken down our amortization table into the pivot table format into a year-by-year format. So next we're going to use that to take a look at our property values, and then we'll take a look at basically the cash flow impacts that will take place. Let's make this a little bit smaller, and let's continue on that next time. We're going a little bit long here. We'll continue on with that next time.